The Animo Archon has finally returned to Genshin Impact, and with him, a ton of new character synergies. If you've recruited this powerful Animo unit, congratulations! You're one step closer to destroying Conry. Today I'm going to be going over the best Venti builds and teams, while also teaching you how to play them. Real quick, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know in the comments, and also I go live a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, so if you want to come hang out, go drop a follow and make sure to turn on notifications. With that being said, I don't want to take up too much of your time, so my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Venti. Real quick, before we get into his builds and everything, I want to talk about his kit, and we're going to be pretty detailed, so make sure to listen in for this part. There's a lot of important stuff. First off, if you're ever feeling down, don't worry, because Venti's elemental skill will pick up everyone else in front of you, unless you hold his skill, in which case he'll pick you up. Both his tap and hold skill deal animo damage and can swirl elements on enemies. When you press the skill, you get 3 particles, whereas holding it will give you 4. While you can use the hold skill to deal slightly more damage per use, the longer cooldown you get from holding it, as well as the time it takes to execute, makes it not worth using in combat most of the time. You'll get more overall damage and energy particles from using the press most of the time, so you should stick with that. But if you're in the overworld, his first passive talent allows you to create an updraft with his hold skill, so that can actually be a nice tool for rock climbing. Unlike Venti's skill though, Venti's burst kinda sucks. No, like it literally sucks. Venti shoots an arrow that creates a vortex that lasts for 8 seconds. It'll get infused with the first element it comes in contact with, so if a hilichurl gets picked up with pyro on him, the burst will turn red and swirl pyro to deal tons of reaction damage. Usually when you're playing Venti, you want to apply the element that you want to swirl with his burst before you actually activate the burst, because it'll only last for 8 seconds and you want to get the most damage possible without spending 2 seconds swapping and applying elements, so it's always good to start with the element on the enemy first. It has a short 15-second cooldown with 60 cost as well, so you can use it fairly often. Venti's burst allows what you call quadratic scaling to happen as well, where some characters' skills and abilities can have their damage exponentially increased due to area damage in Venti's burst. One character that can take advantage of this is Ganyu, who drops a set amount of icicles on enemies every time she uses her burst. If every icicle hits every enemy, the damage that Ganyu is dealing is increased marginally. It is a large increase and makes their synergy incredibly good. Now, Venti's second passive is quite possibly one of the most underrated passives in the game. Maybe underrated isn't the right word, maybe just overlooked. He gives back 15 energy to himself after his burst ends, and 15 energy to any character with the same element that got infused in his burst. It's absurdly good for battery and shouldn't be overlooked at all if you're running teammates with high cost bursts. For some reason, when a lot of people bring up if Venti is still relevant, they kind of forget about the second passive, and it really is just such a good battery utility. Because Venti is an animo unit, he gets a damage boost from elemental mastery when you're dealing with reactions. In 1.6, some reactions got buffed, with swirl being one of the biggest winners. Because of these buffs, it's worth it to level your Venti to 90. It may lift up enemies and lower his possible synergies, but the damage increase is huge now. Level directly correlates with swirl damage all the way up to 90, so definitely get him maxed out. His talents are actually less important to his overall damage than his personal level. You should still level his talents because his burst and skill actually can deal decent damage, in which case you should prioritize his burst, then skill, then basic attacks if you plan on doing that at all. But again, level 90 is more important. So now that you know how Venti's kit works, let's talk about artifacts and how to build them. Venti is one of the most straightforward characters to build in the game when it comes to artifact sets. To keep it simple and quick, you're essentially always going to want to use the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set unless you're in one of these 2 scenarios. A, you're running only Geo or Animo units, or B, you already have a character with 4-piece Viridescent Venerer on the team. 4-piece Viridescent Venerer is just ridiculously broken. It lowers enemy resistances to swirled elements by 40% while increasing swirl damage by 60% and animo damage by 15%. It's arguably the strongest set in the game. You should absolutely use it. If you're ever not using 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, your other options are 4-piece Noblesse Oblige or 4-piece Instructors. Now, of course, if you already have a 4 Noblesse user on the team, you can go for something like 2 Noblesse and 2 Viridescent, but again, I still don't really recommend not using Viridescent Venerer unless you're in one of those 2 scenarios. As far as Instructors goes, it's actually really good for players before AR45 because it's a set that you can get while farming bosses for Ascension materials. You won't want to spend your resin on the Viridescent domain unless you're at AR45 though, since you're not guaranteed a 5-star artifact every run until you unlock the highest level domain. But again, I can't reiterate this enough, you really should never be building Venti on anything but Viridescent unless you already have someone using it, or unless you have a full Geo and Animo team. There's a lot of misunderstandings that happen in the Genshin community with Animo characters, and Venti is no exception. With Venti, some players build him like a DPS with an attack percent sans, an Animo damage goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage circlet, and they'll call him DPS Venti. Other players though opt to build him with elemental mastery on his sans, goblet, and circlet. Now both setups can net you do a ton of damage with Venti, but since the 1.6 patch, it became better in most cases to build Venti with Elemental Mastery rather than crit. On screen now is a comparison of crit and Elemental Mastery Venti swirling 2 enemies. 2 enemies is a pretty safe assumption because of how strong his suction is, but oftentimes you'll actually have more. You'll notice that on the graph, Elemental Mastery is ahead of crit up until around 30 perfect substats. For reference, a Venti with 30 perfect substats is nearly impossible to get. Most players, and by most I mean over 99% of the player base, will not have a Viridescent Venerer set with over 30 perfect attack percent, crit rate, and crit damage substats. For that reason, Elemental Mastery is almost always the safer bet. That being said, in single target scenarios, crit is slightly better than before, requiring only 12 perfect offensive substats to beat out Elemental Mastery. But still, Elemental Mastery Venti is superior in most cases. Funny enough, Elemental Mastery Venti is the true DPS Venti. Overall, an overwhelming majority of players will benefit more from running Elemental Mastery Sands, an Elemental Mastery Goblet, and an Elemental Mastery Circlet. But if you've won the lottery before, you may have a crit setup that's better. That being said, both setups will work in the end. For substats, you're going to want to prioritize Elemental Mastery, Energy Recharge, Attack Percent, and Crit. Just as one last note, it's definitely worth going for at least one set of Elemental Mastery Viridescent pieces. They don't even really need to have good substats. There's just 3 extremely valuable characters that want the set with those stats, and it'll improve your gameplay by a ton to have at least one set of Iridescent Elemental Mastery to play with. So for the weapons section, we're going to be talking about the best options for an Elemental Mastery build for Venti. That being said, most of these weapons are still strong and crit builds for him. It mostly is just going to depend on your substats. First off, Venti's technical best in slot is Stringless at Refinement 5 because it increases skill and burst damage while also using an Elemental Mastery main stat. And even at Refinement 1, it's really strong. But with that in mind, Elegy for the end can still be better for your team. Though Elegy doesn't directly improve Venti's damage, it has an Energy Recharge main stat that basically eliminates the need for Energy Recharge substats on him, and it buffs the rest of your team just by using his burst. I'm more of a fan of Elegy for the team Elemental Mastery and attack buff, but on paper, Stringless will do more personal damage for Venti. So between those two, it's kinda up to you. If you don't have either of these weapons, the free-to-play Windbloom Ode from the first Windbloom Festival is a solid option for him, both because of its stats and because of its passive. If you don't have that, Alley Hunter is gonna be another solid choice just because it increases his damage when he's not on the field. Other great weapons are Skyward Harp for solid attack and crit stats, Raven Bow at R5 for damage bonus and Elemental Mastery, Moon's Moon for burst damage bonus if you have high cost bursts on your team, Prototype Crescent for stats, and Favonius Warbow for energy recharge and battery if you need it. Now, as it stands, there's not really a reason to use any of the other weapons in the game currently, since you can get 2 of these weapons without using any gacha at all, and they're all super good. Worst case scenario, you do get a free Favonius Warbow from the main story quest, so just play the game up till there and you should have one. Though the artifact section was probably the most straightforward thing about building Venti, teams aren't too far off. The line of thinking with Venti teams is this: characters who deal AoE damage in Venti's burst are able to hit multiple enemies at the same time, which amplifies the total damage output you're getting because of enemies being so close together. Or in Razor speak, wide damage in air make damage big.
I like potatoes.
I actually made a spreadsheet that shows who can hit small enemies in Venti ult a long time ago, but I kinda forgot about it. So Venti mains took it over, and it's a great resource. It's going to be in the description if you want to check it out. I highly recommend looking at it if you're trying to build your own custom Venti team. If you don't feel like forming your own teams though, here are some solid options. The first option is a form of Taser, featuring Venti, Fischl, Beto, and Kokomi. In Electrocharge teams with Venti, if you infuse his burst with Hydro, Electrocharge reactions can be ridiculously strong. If you apply Electro to enemies in the Hydro Venti burst, you'll constantly proc Electrocharge, and it'll be based off of Venti's Elemental Mastery. Combine that with Kokomi's burst dealing increased damage, Beto snapshotting the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's buff, and Fischl batterying Beto and dealing extra electro damage, this team absolutely obliterates enemies. If you don't have Kokomi, you can run Barbara or Mona, since both of their charged attack scalings actually aren't too bad. This team is less effective against unmovable enemies, but to be honest, that's every Venti team. One last thing about this team is that you can pretty much assume that Ayato will work in it, since his slashes look pretty big and his burst looks like Ganyu's based off the dev stream. If his damage output is solid, he'll complement Taser super well in place of Kokomi. The next option I want to show you guys is Morgana, which is a broken permafreeze team. In Morgana, you run Ganyu, Venti, Mona, and Diona. The idea with Morgana is that you want Venti's burst to be infused with Cryo. Mono's damage buff can be extended if you freeze enemies with the actual Omen debuff. That means using her burst when enemies already have Cryo on them. So you're going to use that after Venti's burst, then you swap to Ganyu and start chipping away at enemy health with huge buffs. You can take full advantage of Venti's quadratic scaling here with Ganyu, since her icicles will hit some enemies multiple multiple times. You can also replace Diana with Ayaka since her burst is disgustingly strong against frozen enemies and it'll increase the damage of the team overall. Morgana does fall off pretty hard against enemies that can't be frozen, but the overall value of the team is there. If need be, you can replace Mona with Kokomi as well. Another pretty fun team with Venti features Xiao, Venti, Albedo, and Zhongli. Now you might be thinking, Brax, there are no reactions in this team. What are you thinking? Well, to be honest, I'm not. This team utilizes Xiao as a main DPS while keeping Venti for damage and a strong battery. Xiao dashes can hit enemies in Venti's burst, and when you don't cross over both Xiao and Venti's burst, the team ends up being really strong. Albedo also has quadratic scaling with his burst when combined with Venti, which ends up multiplying his burst damage by a ton. And Zhongli lowers enemy resistances, so the team just has a lot of synergy. One thing to note about this team though is that it's one of the only teams where you'd want to take a crit build Venti over an elemental mastery build Venti. You can also substitute Albedo with Bennett if you want, but having Bennett free for your other team is a big plus, and one of the main reasons I like this team, because whatever team has Bennett on, it's going to be easy anyways, so you just use this team and then have Bennett on literally anything else. Once again, I just want to reiterate that though I only listed those 3 teams, basically any character that can hit in Venti's burst is a strong pick for a team with them. Characters that deal AoE damage are much stronger, and Catalyst DPS like Ningguang, for example, are very good in combination with Venti. For real, if you don't like any of the teams I listed, take a look at the chart in the description. It is really helpful. So before I wrap up my final thoughts on Venti, I want to quickly go over his constellations and explain why none of these are really worth pulling for unless you literally main the character or just C6 everyone. His first constellation makes it so that when you fire an aimed shot, you actually fire 2 more shots next to the original one that deal 33% of the original arrow's damage. This constellation is a pretty small damage increase, but makes him slightly better as a main DPS against larger enemies. Overall, I wouldn't recommend going for it though. His second constellation decreases enemy physical and animo resistance when using his elemental skill. It's a 12% decrease for 10 seconds. Enemies who are in the air will also get a bonus 12% more physical and animo resistance decrease. Though it's one of the few animo shreds in the game, it's still a small damage increase for getting 2 constellations. His third constellation increases his burst level by 3, but talent levels aren't as important as Venti's character level. His fourth constellation makes it so that when Venti picks up an energy particle, he gains a 25% animo damage bonus. It's a good damage increase for crit Venti, but at Constellation 4, it's very expensive. Constellation 5 increases his elemental skill level by 3, and Constellation 6 decreases enemy animo resistance by 20%, and also acts as a pseudo-viridescent Venerer buff by decreasing enemy resistances to the elements swirled by his burst. His Constellation 6 is actually very strong, but with it requiring you to pull Venti 7 times in total, I really can't recommend it. It's not 7 Venti strong. Overall, the biggest issue with Venti constellations is that they're catered towards a main DPS or crit build for Venti, which is just suboptimal in most cases. Unless you're a Venti main and have money to burn, I really just can't recommend pulling for his constellations. Venti is already a complete unit at C0. You don't need constellations for him to be good. He's already great. Though Hoyoverse has tried to nerf Venti with the release of Inazuma, he's still kinda broken. His damage output is ridiculously high, he refunds energy after using burst, and of course just being an animo unit, he's great for debuffing enemies. On top of all of that, Venti is super free to play friendly. Like, it literally doesn't matter what weapon and artifacts you use on him, you're still going to be able to group enemies as long as they're not massive. Though his top teams might not all be free to play, you can basically throw him in any team where your characters can deal damage to lifted enemies, and he just makes all of the content in the game extremely easy. And I'm sure you'll see why in the coming Abyss. Sumeru, please have small enemies again, I am begging you. Anyways guys, that's about it for this video. If it helped you, let me know in the comments and consider leaving a like on the video. Subscribe for more super epic awesome content, and I hope to see you guys over on the Twitch too. I'll catch you next time.